Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, Patmati, old friends, young friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. 200 years ago, Raffles established Singapore as a trading post for the China trade. In the 19th century, the jewel in the British crown was India, and India's biggest trading partner was China. We are now seeing before us a new China trade, much bigger than the one in the 19th century. Our history profoundly affects who we are and what our future will be. In the last 40 years, China's growth has been phenomenal, resulting in China impinging on the rest of the world, causing almost an inevitable reaction. If China's GDP per capita, when it reaches half that of the US, its GDP will be twice that of the US. When China's GDP reaches two-thirds of the US, its GDP will be roughly that of the US, EU, and Japan combined. I think it's entirely possible that China's per capita GDP reaches two-thirds of the US. So this is the future unfolding before us. And it's creating considerable discomfort in the neighborhood and beyond. In Asia, countries are going back to the history books to try to figure out what China was like in the past. Because in that past lies opportunities and wisdom for the future. It is numbers. But it's not only numbers. China's population will peak at 1.44 billion in 2029, according to Beijing. And India's population will surely overtake that of China. But it is not just population. It is the fact of China's homogeneity, with over 90% of its people Han, believing in the midst of a common ancestry, having common heroes, celebrating common festivals. Of course, there's considerable regional diversity, but the Chinese people, including the Chinese outside China, feel that they belong to one race. And because of that, when China is united, its productivity is awesome. But of course, when it declines, the decline is also awesome. And that explains the long cycles of Chinese history. You take the restoration of China under the Ming, 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, Nanjing. By 1405, the great voyages were launched. Just 37 years. 37 years to consolidate a continental country, to develop industry, to generate the surplus, the technology in so many fields. The fleets had cartographers, astronomers, scientists, soldiers, diplomats, farmers. I mean, they had chicken farms. They grew vegetables. And they had all over the Indian Ocean shipyards, because these are wooden ships. They needed repair. In Chirabon, where there is Gunung Jati, at the base of it, there's a shipyard. And Tan Tarsen told me how the Sultan, who owns much of the land there, wants to redevelop it as a heritage site for the Belt and Road. For there, the ships were repaired, all the way to Africa. For those further away, in particular for America, they don't have the history. And when they look at China, they view it very differently. When I met Alison Graham in Beijing a few weeks ago, he said, look, this anti-China mood in America is going to get much worse. As Tommy said, as Sparta once saw a rising Athens. This trial of strength, oscillating between a Cold War and a Cold Peace, will continue for easily another 20 years to come, each testing the other. But America worried, what does a rising China portend? So both sides have publicly said they're preparing for war. A few months ago, the former US Army commander in Europe, Ben Hodges, Lieutenant General, he said war between US and China likely within 15 years. I was in the armed forces before. If you must fight within 15 years, and you know that your enemy is getting stronger year by year, you prefer to fight tonight. As Harry Harris often said, be prepared to fight tonight. Of course, war between the US and China, that's madness. But both sides have to prepare for it. But this is the single most important relationship shaping our world today, the US-China relations. If it is bungled, all bets are off. All of us will be torn apart, as countries, as cities, as companies, as families. Happily, unlike the old Soviet Union, China is not a missionary power. China does not see maritime voyages the way Admiral Mahan saw the oceans. I tell my American friends, think about it. Why does every Chinese dynasty rebuild the Great Wall? And many of us are familiar with the strains of the Chinese national anthem, Qi Lai. In that national anthem, recited countlessly, sung countlessly, the Chinese talked about rebuilding a new Great Wall. This is because it is difficult enough organizing the Han people and other nationalities in China. And their foreign policy has always been defensive in character. Every Chinese leader reads and rereads Sun Tzu, The Art of War. You have to understand war, and you must be prepared for war. But you are a fool to go into war lightly. Because war, once you begin, will exhaust you and lead to consequences you cannot anticipate. If you watch the way China is managing relations with the US now, very careful. And I believe the current trade negotiations are likely to succeed because China will go 80% of the way to meet US demands. Not because they are afraid or generous, but because they know that time is on their side. Last weekend, I met a Singapore businessman who goes to China often, has a big business in China. So I asked him, how's China? Meaning the economy. He said, bad. In one word, bad. China has been deleveraging deliberately, giving help only to important sectors which they cannot allow to go down. But the last easing after the global financial crisis created a lot of excesses which they are trying to squeeze out of the system. And they know in every field they're advancing, slowly, feeling their own strength. This rivalry between the US and China will continue until the US is convinced that China's nature is different from that of the US and different from that of the Soviet Union. And it will take time, and China will have to do its part to reassure its neighbors and the other major powers that its nature is different, that its statecraft is principally defensive. And all of us who are at the intersection between these two great countries should play our part to help bridge the differences. You take the TPP as an example. Tommy talked about it. I was involved in establishing it together with Brunei, Chile, and New Zealand many years ago. I remember trying to persuade Xu Guangsheng, China Trade Minister, to join. He said, no, we have already given too much joining the WTO. We can't do this. And then the Americans came in, and under Obama, and they turned it into an anti-China coalition, which I thought was a mistake. Then, by happenstance, Trump became president, and the US removed itself from the TPP. Fortunately, Prime Minister Abe decided to see it through, push it through. I think Singapore, Japan, and other countries should encourage China to join the TPP. But prolong the negotiations. This will encourage, even force the US to come back in. Because if it's the US and the TPP, including China, it'll be a problem for the US. But we must do this artfully, coordinate the negotiations so that they join at the same time. And whatever China is prepared to give to the US, we say, give it to the TPP. Now, intellectual property is the single most important trade issue in the coming years because of digitalization. When Tommy negotiated the free trade agreement between Singapore and the US, IP was a big issue and threatened to derail negotiations. And I remember as trade minister calling a special meeting, and we asked ourselves, what is our own future? And we came to the conclusion that it was also IP. So instead of fighting the US, we went with the US, and today Singapore is a major intellectual property center in all of Asia, to our great advantage. So it is in China's interest to move on IP. And it's in the US interest. And if the TPP includes China and the US, the WTO will have to follow in its wake, and you will have a safer world. Trump thinks that the US enjoys an advantage in bilateralizing relationships. So they reduce the importance of the WTO, the UN, other international organizations. Imagine one day China inheriting a bilateralized global system. Now, Imperial China perfected it through the tribute system. And this is almost instinctual for China, to bilateralize relationships and to use economics for political purposes. But it is not good for China. And it is not good for the US or any of us for the world to become like that. So moving on a TPP, getting both China and the US in, is in fact an important road to a much safer future for all of us. For Singapore, every country, every region is now re-triangulating because of the rise of China. And for Singapore, ASEAN is very important. Because ASEAN gives us buffer, shelters us from the cold winds of superpower rivalry. And it is enlightened self-interest why Singapore puts ASEAN at the center of its foreign policy. But what drives our future is not only the external environment, it is who we are inside. You know, Singapore may be a very small city-state, but if you look at our cultural genome, we have a very big genome. Because of Raffles, because of our role in the old China trade, because of our role in the coming China trade. So in us, we have a protean capability to evolve in different directions. So as China becomes more important, we deepen our knowledge of China. India will become the world's biggest economy, second biggest economy, sometime later this century, and we will grow our links to India. Indonesia will be the fourth. And Bahasa, which some of us thought had become a relic language in Singapore for the non-Malays, will become important again because of Indonesia. Politically, it's always difficult to manage this diversity in our genome. So the preference is always to simplify it, reduce it, so that we are at the lower homeostasis, as it were. But it would be suicidal. Because it is because of our genome that we have this resilience and this ability to adapt to a range of possible futures. It's our best foolproofing, future-proofing of our economy and of our country. We sometimes get so caught up with the inconvenience, with the quarrels among ourselves, that we say, no, let's reduce the diversity. Last night, Pak Marty and I had a leisurely stroll along Changi Beach and wanted to show him a monument we erected in 1992, 50th anniversary of the fall of Singapore, to mark Suk Ching, the killings on Changi Beach. And we deliberately did it in 4 languages, 4 official languages, with Japanese at the bottom. Because it's important for the Japanese to know this history too. I was so dismayed to find that that monument had been replaced by one which is purely in English. Now, I understand the reasons why it is convenient, whether it's in Changi Airport or whether it is at our museums, to have one language. This is deliberately reducing our cultural genome because sometimes it creates autoimmune reactions and so on for short-term purposes. It is denying us of a powerful capability and a precious inheritance from the past, which in fact will secure our future. We cannot avoid, in Singapore, always having debates about race, language, religion, identity. Every link which connects us to China, to India, to Indonesia, to the Middle East, every link is both a plus and creates problems. Every link is two-way. What connects is also a method of infiltration. So we have to adjust to all this. The day we decide that it is too tiring to do all this, that day we will shrivel and become inconsequential. You know, I go to the Vatican 5 times a year for meetings of the Council for the Economy. At every meeting, interpreters, earphones. The day the church stops using earphones and interpretation, it is no longer the church. The day Singapore decides to reduce its genome so that we become homogenized, that would be a very uninteresting Singapore. And I'm certainly unworthy of a session such as this. Thank you.